So I just want to take a moment to thank you all for being here. This is, you experience the 2 days that you spend, a year working on, and just sort of, on the one hand, are grateful for every second of the time that you have with the people you're with, and at the same time think, oh my gosh, could we just have one more day? So I do want to just take a moment to say thank you very, very much. And those who are coming in afterwards just missed that note of grace. So, especially for you. Okay. The flow of the topics of the program has really turned out to be very felicitous. And this next topic, this next panel, who owns culture, who owns cultural resources, we sort of agonized over, four little words, 4 big words, is one that I'm really deeply passionate about. I am so thrilled that we have the group assembled to talk with us about this, that we do. So on this panel, we are joined by Ivor Agyeman-Duah, and Ivor spoke yesterday in the keynote address about gold and Ghana. And as is, I hope, clear, this is something that, again, 2 little days, maybe someday we'll get 3, but this is a complicated and important subject. Emma Cole, a jeweler, goldsmith, and curator of jewelry of the diaspora, the V&A, and Emma is really a magnificent maker in addition to everything else. And she has brought some work with her today, which I hope people will take an opportunity to see at lunch and to just realize, how accomplished each person is. She's extraordinary, and I can do this because it's not my work. Both she and Uta have pieces in the V&A. Next is J.C. Munanka, who is head of Legal Operations Africa for Anglo Gold Ashanti, and they play as an entity a critical role in the region. So it's wonderful to hear about this today, and we will continue to revisit. And a warm welcome for the first time. And then, so happily, Lucian Simmons, who is head of provenance research at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And then our moderator is Liz Fraccaro, and Liz is newly with the JVC as the assistant counsel, but has a there is no but, and has a fabulous background and interest in antiquities, restitution, and provenance. So we couldn't have a better gathering, and I'm grateful to you all. So it's yours. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. I'd like to get us started with a bit of a group discussion, starting off with a question about the materiality of gold. Gold is not just a resource, it's ritual, it is royalty, and it's resistance. How does its meaning shift depending on where and how it is used and displayed?
Well, so good afternoon. Good afternoon, everybody. I come from that part of Africa where we do a lot of mining of gold. And even before then, before colonial rule, going back to the 1700s, we had gold in what became the Gold Coast and then now Ghana. So gold has been with us. It's defined our economy, even during colonial rule, and post-colonial rule. We still export a lot of gold, the leaders in Africa, and we have a cultural space where gold as a commodity also plays a major role. From the Ashanti Empire of about 300 years, passing through the other smaller empires that constituted what became the Gold Coast, gold was, of course, a very meaningful commodity. About 30 years ago this month, there was a major exhibition here in New York called Asante Kingdom of Gold, which was hosted by the mayor of New York and brought in the king of Asante to New York. It was a marvelous exhibition of what gold as a cultural commodity was to the people of Ghana at the time, because it went beyond just that geographic space of Asante into a metropolitan city like New York. So gold has been with us. We love gold, but we also have problems with gold in terms of the production process, in terms of where it gets to, in terms of the value that should be added to gold. So it could be a grassroots sort of growth factor, which we haven't got yet. So with time, and I'm sure as we do things properly, we will be able to catch up with the dynamics of the gold market and gold as a factor of growth.
Gold. For me, I mean, when I look at the history, especially with relation to West Africa, I think of this legend but true story of Mansa Musa, which I believe that pilgrimage he took from the Kingdom of Mali to Mecca was the beginning of what we're facing today, because it really highlighted how rich the region was in gold, and that then brought in the Portuguese, and then the Brits, and the Germans, and I mean, I can go on, and that led to, you know, the transatlantic slave trade, then discovery of gold in South America, and so on. That's all sort of like the horrible side of this material. And I work with gold, so I think it's a beautiful material, but it's just such a complex metal that has this ability to bring out the worst of human nature, and but then people like me can create amazing things that outlive all of us. So yeah, it's a very complex material, beautiful, problematic, divine, dirty. I could just keep going on and on. I'll pass over to you guys.
Okay, well, I have a three-part answer to this. The first thing is, working for the Metropolitan Museum, gold has no intrinsic value. Because when a piece of gold enters a museum, it's not tradable and it becomes fossilized, so it has no value over and above a piece of copper or over and above a stone sculpture. So in a way, it's invaluable, rather it has no value. And that's kind of the museum view. The second thing I was going to say, really coming off what Amefa said, is that gold never goes away. One of the things that's exciting for me in terms of storytelling and in terms of the metal itself is that the gold ring I'm wearing, which came from my great-great-uncle, could have been mined in Phoenician times, it could have been mined in West Africa, it could have been mined in Cornwall. I don't know, but that metal has never gone away, and it's part of my story, and it's a continuum. So the metal itself lives forever, and I think that's one of the exciting things that artists can do, is to actually bring that out. And the third thing I was going to say is that gold also, for me, is exciting because it means it's more than just an object. So I have a good friend coming to stay with me tomorrow from England, and he always says when he travels, he always wears a white gold watch. And he wears a white gold watch because his family are Jewish and escaped from Holland in World War II. And he always says, I wear a watch which I can get out of the country with. If everything goes to hell, I know the value of what's on my wrist will get me a plane ticket, or will be instead of a passport. So for me, gold is also a reservoir of value and carries people's future with it.
The only other thing I'd add is, I mean, we're gold miners. right? We just get gold out of the ground and sell it. But in doing so, we transform societies. We have 40,000 employees. If you do the multiplier factor, you're sitting there, if you do a 10 to 1 in terms of employees or people working in gold and their impact, their ability to support their families, you're looking at hundreds of thousands of people. We go into spaces, whether it's Guinea or Ghana, Tanzania, DRC, Egypt, you go into places, folks may not have visited. It's not the capitals where gold is found. And you transform these areas. The pay is also a lot, in often cases, a lot higher for the employees there and the contractors. You're able to, we're the highest taxpayer in certain countries. So I think that the value of gold, it's really cool to hear, the magical aspect of it. But from a practical perspective and the way that we see it, it transforms societies. And we're really happy to be able to contribute to that.
Kind of touching on this undefinable value of gold that's so changeable, I'm going to ask another difficult question that I think everyone will have a different answer to. But what does it mean to own a cultural object, one made of gold or otherwise? Which is to say, who has that moral or legal authority to make claims? Is it a government? Is it a kingdom, a museum, a corporation even, or a community or individual?
Before we had the nation, Ghana, there were states, traditional states, that had cultural indices. And so each state or ethnic group, for want of a better word, had their own cultural setup. How people should behave, the ethnical values of the small group, and then how that will transfer or translate into relationship with others. When we became a nationhood, of course, the art and the creativity of these groups came together in an attempt to forge a nation state of a sort. It doesn't also mean that all the artworks, including gold, if we sort of taking away the value, were not of the same level of appreciation. And so when we talk of return of cultural objects, or government or other people leading the return of these, we are looking at one, the new government, which has replaced the old traditional societies, taking lead of this. But in some cases, and in particular, some states I know in West Africa, these do not work. The governments are not very interested in acquisition or the return of some of these ancient objects. And so, they don't push. And if you don't push in a situation like this, you also don't get what you want. So governments should lead, but in situations where, because governments are not very interested in the cultural setup, which is reflected in the budget allocation, if there are traditional authorities that are strong and have the gravitas to do that, I feel they should be able to do that with the support of government. And so that is where I'm coming in. I'm coming in because there was a traditional setup that created this. And there is a traditional setup that's been interested in getting these things back, even though there is a government. So those who claim should be those who are interested in seeing these objects back.
I believe that the people who own these objects, so we're talking about looted Asante regalia in particular, Ivor and I, and the people who own it are the Asante people who it was taken from. The current setup in most African countries, actually all of them I believe, these governments are as a result of colonial rule. It wasn't the way that we governed our nations, like Ivor said. And so you have to respect how things were at the time of the looting. And I always tell people, Ivor, I'm not an Asante, but I strongly believe that the Asante gold belongs to the Asante people, because as a half Ga, half Ewe or Ewe person, that means nothing to my people, but it has spiritual, it's of spiritual significance and importance to the Asante people, and they made it for a reason. And the same with, Lucy, and any sort of loot in the Met's collection from South America and so on, it belongs to the people it was taken from. And so when we are, I find myself in sort of two different worlds, so from the museum world and then also being of Ghanaian heritage, but in this particular subject, I am saying we as the museum, and we need to speak with the communities that the pieces belong to, not the government.
Absolutely, and I might be targeting this question a little bit, but I am curious, given that these colonial legacies are shaping our contemporary understandings of this kind of ownership concept, in our conference discussion, it was brought up that there's existing legal frameworks here that are really not fit for this purpose. And I'd like to kind of explore what these consequences are when the legal ownership conflicts with the cultural belonging of an object.
Yeah, maybe I'll take a crack. And, it's like, why is he here? So yeah, and again, I'm going to use the word own or custodian, whatever, for lack. I'm a lawyer, right? Just forgive me. So we, in 2000, Anglo Gold bought a collection of gold artifacts that was in Switzerland, the Barbier-Mueller collection. About 350 artifacts. And again, it seems like every word is loaded. I'm learning. Even the use of the word artifacts is, I guess, questionable or can be challenged.
I think it was me. I said that. Yeah.
Okay, so what word would you like me to use?
Honestly, please feel free.
Okay, I just don't want to, again, it's again, minor lawyer, just accept those limitations. So we bought this collection in 2000, and it was in Switzerland. And the idea at the time was, okay, cool, let's take it from Switzerland and bring it to Africa to kind of show, because it's African gold at the end of the day. And it wasn't just Ghana, again, understanding the colonial aspects of things, but just accepting that, that this is the current way things are. Ghana, Mali, some other Western African countries. So we took that and put these artifacts into a nonprofit whose purpose was to show these artifacts and share them and give them exposure in Africa, right? So Anglo Gold opened up a museum in Cape Town that was designed by the same individual who subsequently went on to design the Apartheid Museum that I don't know if folks have seen, but it's a pretty incredible place in Joburg. And, and it showed the history of gold and art, African artisans, across Western Africa, right? Then around 2000, that was around 2001 or 2002, around 2012 or 13, gold prices crashed, and we ended up having to put those artifacts in storage for a few years, right? We couldn't fund the museum. Then in around 2018, the University of Pretoria said, hey, we'd love to show this gold. And we ended up taking the gold and having the University of Pretoria exhibit it. And they did so until, I think around, around 2023 or so? Yeah. The Asante and the tie-in with the Asante, right? We have a mine, it's called Obuasi, right? Anglo Gold. They've been mining, officially, the official date is like 1897 as far as when gold started getting mined from Obuasi. I mean, practically, as Ivor will tell you, it's been a lot longer than that. The gold's been coming out of there. But Obuasi is on Asante land, right? So we mined at the discretion and at the, we're privileged to be able to mine that mine. But it's a Santi, right? So, 2023, 2024, we started engaging with the Santi through Ybor because of a museum that was being established, and I'm sure you'll speak to it. I'm not going to give the details, all the details around that, but a museum, a Santi museum, right? And so, again, goes into the issue of custodian versus ownership versus all that stuff. A request was made. Hey, you have, your collection contains Asante gold artifacts. And we're like, you're right. And, he's like, there's a jubilee coming up, the 25th anniversary of the king being on the throne. We would like to have those objects as part of the launch of the museum. Again, fantastic. That goes back to what kind of the core idea of this nonprofit is, which is to share and show these artifacts. The question then became, well, okay, that's great, but how do you do it, right? And how do you do it in the time frame that fits with the Asantes? And that's where you go to, there's just a lack of real regulations. I mean, I'd love to have just taken a luggage and stuck the artifacts in some luggage and just handed it over, right? But that's not the way things work. And, so we ended up, using, the crazy thing is, like, there's regulations that deal with products that have gold in them, right? And so you end up asking, and again, understanding the limitations of national governments, we end up asking South African Reserve Bank, because these artifacts are gold-bearing material, right? So the regulation that we end up using relates to not to the intrinsic nature and the cultural aspect and the beauty and the phenomenon of all that. It's just, it was gold. And we say, hey, can we transport these artifacts over to Ghana and give the rationale? And, with a little to and froing, we were able to get that to happen, right? So that kind of explains a few things. One, why I'm on the panel. Two, answering your question in terms of the struggle that you have in terms of the regulations and the regulatory space to be able to do what Ybor and the Asante had asked, and also to align with what you spoke about in terms of ownership. We just view ourselves as custodians, but you're limited by the regulatory framework which you have, and you just have to use those tools to be able to get to the solution, the outcome, which was fortunately to be able to get the artifacts to be able to show them for the Jubilee.
Okay. Well, there is this issue of cultural rights, and sometimes we do put many things together, art of all kinds, and then we called that collection artifacts. But some of these cultural rights, and especially some of the objects that were made in Kumasi and Asante, for instance, were not just artworks. These were regalia from the palace that were looted during the 1898 wars with the British. These objects were functional objects that were being used for ceremonial prayers, that were being used when new babies come, that were being used when we bury the dead. So they may come across to the outsider as objects of art, but they had ceremonial and functional uses within the palace. And it wasn't only with the Asante, it was actually the same with the Benin bronzes that were taken out. They had meanings, they were connected to the palace. That is why the royal artisans were living in the palace, as they do in Asante. So cultural rights, fine. But then it is beyond cultural rights, and the objects are beyond just the visual satisfaction we get when we look at them.
Yeah. Lucian, you have some experience with trying to navigate all of this, but from the kind of museum institutional perspective. Do you want to speak to that?
I do. So as Amefa said, and as you've heard, it's a question of custodianship. And for the Metropolitan Museum, we feel we're custodians under our foundation for the people of New York and for our 6 million visitors a year, but also very strongly we feel we're custodians for the creators of artifacts throughout the museum, artifacts, cultural property, artworks, all of which kind of overlap and are all wrong words to use. One of the things that's been most exciting for me in the past 2 or 3 months was to be part of the reopening of the Michael C. Rockefeller wing at the Met, which is the wing which contains objects of art and culture from ancient Americas, from Africa, and from Oceania. And to try and get away from the old-fashioned museum way of looking at this as ethnography, which is very much a telescope looking at somebody else, looking at them, and also moving away from saying we're an art museum, let's look at these objects as if they're Western artworks, and let's appreciate them for their beauty, which is also wrong, because that's also insulting to the creators and to the descendants of the creators. So one of the things we've been super excited by has been to involve the descendants of the creators of the pieces and the collection in the storytelling and helping them to tell their own stories. And I think the best example I have is not, I'm afraid, to do with gold, but if you come to the Met, which I hope you will, there's an enormous ceiling in the Rockefeller wing, which is 80 feet long and was commissioned by the Met from the Hill peoples in New Guinea in the early 1970s. And it was commissioned from the men of 2 villages, and the ceiling represents the dreams of those villages and the dreams of the ancestors and the dreams of the gods that regulated their everyday lives. And they almost imprisoned those dreams in the ceiling. And it was on the roof of the Met, or on the ceiling of the galleries for many years. But when it was reinstalled, what we did was to go back to the grandchildren of the artists and say, this isn't the Met's culture, this is your culture. Can you help us tell your story to the people who come to the Met? Because we don't want to own your story, we want you to own your own story, and to help people to understand where you come from, why it's important, and why your ceiling should be part of New York's culture and New York's heritage. So it's a kind of a weird example, but that's the Met's attitude to this, to try and help people to tell their own cultural stories and not to treat things as artifacts or as objects or as like a butterfly pinned to a piece of cardboard, but to actually help breathe life into the objects in the museum, whether it's gold, whether it's a painting, whether it's a carpet. It doesn't matter, but to try and make things live.
I was wondering if we could perhaps get the slide deck up. I was trying to advance it, but Lucian did submit some photos for us, including one of the ceiling in the Rockefeller wing, which I think everyone would enjoy looking at. But in the interim, I'd also kind of like to talk about, here it is. You can see the ceiling along the top there.
I should say, sorry, I shouldn't really take up time, but when the wing reopened 2 months ago, we invited the families of the creators of the ceiling back, and we had a ceremony under the ceiling to reconsecrate it. So when you're there, it's not just a museum exhibit, it's also a sacred space, which is part of the Hill Tribes community of New Guinea.
And also there's so much gold.
And there's a lot of gold.
So much gold, yeah. Amazing.
I know that we've spoken about working with kind of living in contemporary cultural groups and co-curation here. I'm curious, Emma, your experience working as a contemporary artist with an institution.
Oh gosh, yes. Gosh, good question. It's been very, very interesting, sort of, I feel it's a very unique position to be able to have a studio where I'm practicing and then be working as a curator, and I can sort of just navigate both worlds, and sometimes they blend together and then they're separate, but yeah, it's very much one blends into the other. And in this particular, if we can stick with my role and with the Asante Lutheran Regalia, So you probably know this, but I'll bore you with it very quickly. The V&A, during an auction after the British returned to London, there was an auction held by Garrard, British, very famous British jewellery house. And they auctioned off the Asante regalia. Do you know roughly how many pieces were stolen? I don't think there's,
But in thousands.
it was thousands and thousands, so it's spread out globally. V&A bought 17. The reason being that if you know the history of the V&A, it's to inspire designers and makers of the present and the future. So it's really sort of like an educational institution. So they bought it for those purposes, so that people would look at them, study them, and maybe make similar things. But fast forward to last year, they were finally returned on long-term loan to Ghana for the same reason that you were loaning back your, sorry, we have to use the term loan, no disrespect, it's just the National Heritage Act of England and, well, Britain prevents us from giving things back permanently to some countries unless it's Nazi looted objects. And so because of that, we were really excited as an institution to be able to do this and then partner up. So it's not a case of you just give things back and that's the end of the relationship. To partner up with the Asante to then do something new, more refreshing. So dealing with the past as best as we can, but forward thinking. And it just so happened that prior to joining the V&A, I was actually working with the Royal Goldsmith as his apprentice. And so that then came back together where we've made a piece in response to the loot going back. And it's part of our renewable cultural partnership, and it's been a real partnership. So it wasn't just me and Nana who made this piece. It started off with me sort of asking Charlie, who's here from Betts, to source some single mine origin gold for us. Unfortunately, not from Ghana because we don't have an SMO mine in Ghana, but this gold came from Senegal. For me, it doesn't really matter because I really do not respect those colonial borders that separate the countries. And so using gold from Senegal, and then I made, Charlie gave me the gold discs, and I worked with Master Goldsmith, Clive in London, and then carried on in Ghana with the Royal Goldsmith and coming back. And I've had so many people helping to really bring this sculpture to life. Sorry, we can't share any pictures, but it will be available on the V&A's website soon. But yeah, it's been interesting, so I can dip in and deal with the curatorial side of things, and then I can also step in with the making side of things, doing what I really love doing. And yeah, it's quite a unique position to be in. And I think that there should be more maker curators, and I believe that was a thing of the past. It was a thing where you had maker curators when museums first started. So yeah, it's nice. We sort of have this intimate relationship with the materials and the objects, and you have a more in-depth understanding. And actually, shall I let your secret out?
Yeah.
Yeah. Lucian also actually should answer this question because he loves making with silver.
Yes.
Well, yes. I mean, so one of my other lives, I also design silver, as well as being a lawyer. And I'm wearing now a belt, which I'm not going to take off because my trousers will fall down. But it's a belt which is meaningful to me because I was given a buckle from the German Imperial yacht from 1913, which was given by the Crown Prince of Prussia to a young English girl on the slopes in St. Moritz. He fell in love with her. She was on her way from Bombay to London to go into an arranged marriage. He was going to go back to Prussia to become future king or future emperor. And this to me was wonderful because it was a moment that caught an illicit moment of freedom for these two people. So I had it cast in silver, and I wear it every day, and I've worn it for 30 years. And I've given it to 3 or 4 close friends, other copies of it. And so for me, that's what silver can do. It can hold a story, hold a memory, and for me, hold an idea that we're not bound by national borders.
Yes.
That's fantastic. And I realize now we have 3 lawyers here, and we're all going to be a little obsessed about our terminology, right? Because the law requires preciseness in that. And it brings me back to a quote from one of my case books in law school that was, "Art eludes definition, but law requires it." And circling back to our earlier question about ownership and that tension of when law that exists right now is really not suit for purpose. When we're dealing with ownership that may not align with the cultural group that is there because of this colonial history. I wanted to talk a little bit about provenance and research. How should institutions and corporations handle objects with unclear or fragmented provenance? I know all of you have dealt with this, and there's many different answers to this, and I don't necessarily think there is one right answer to it, but I'd love to hear everyone's perspectives.
Well, I think that is also in degrees. What is the unknown history of an object? What is the known history of that object? And in terms of ownership, where does it go now that there is an opportunity for it to travel back? So ownership and history are very critical in interpreting how these objects should go back. And if they're going back, as we've said, to where does it go? To the original creators of the objects, to the institution that created these objects, or to the state government or the leadership of the nation. So these are very critical things to look at, and sometimes the lack of knowledge of the histories of these looted objects could be very critical. We're coming from an oral society where, as I said, many of these objects were functional. They were being used for specific purposes before they transitioned to being artworks or artifacts. So if that is the case, how do you interpret or find the history that will align with this? Because these were not written. They were oral things that we were engaged in. And so those who took these objects, who looked at the objects, then decided to write some of these histories down from the oral version of what they heard. So when you go to the British Museum, because we don't have the objects, and they do, and because the military leaders or those who were engaged in the campaign were supposed to write down notes, which have been very well kept, you're relying on the memoirs of these military leaders, those looters who were there, and also the official government reports that came with this to interpret what probably is your own history. Because you are coming from an orality of a place where those who probably knew the functions of these were gone. But the thing also is, there continue to be new creations because the palace artisans who were there had others who replaced them. And so, when I was, for instance, inspecting the objects that will be taken back to Kumasi at the British Museum, I selected 17, and then I went through the 17 with the creator, who's a British white, but who is also very good at looking after these objects. I picked those ones to Kumasi for further discussions, picked them not as taking them physically, but photographed them, and then at the discussion that we had with the king, and those who would normally be in charge of these objects at the palace, they were able to easily identify these objects and to give brief histories of each, which sort of tallied with what histories there were at the British Museum, which for me was also very fascinating. So it was based on that authentication from Kumasi, after seeing the updates, that we were able to then say that these are the ones we will want to take back.
We had situations where things have been completely wrongly catalogued because people didn't understand, the curators didn't understand what the pieces were and what the symbols were. So then sort of having a few FaceTimes with the Royal Goldsmith and his staff telling us what things were supposed to be, we then corrected the errors in the cataloguing.
Yeah, it's a great question, right? My take on it is, you know, we're gold miners, right? So there's things that we can do and there's things that we can't do well. We happen to have this collection, but that's not our business, right? So, you know, so when Ybor came down and went to the museum and pointed out these objects, and he's the historian for the Central Bank of Ghana and the director of the museum, and we have, you know, years and years of trust between ourselves as a company and the Asante. That's enough from our perspective. That's provenance. It's established. It's done. Let's make it happen, right? And, you know, we were able, fortunately, to do this again.
Yes.
Earlier this year, you know, Ybor, again, as a representative of the king, was able to come and identify further objects. The king, we're, you know, really happy that he was able to also come and see these objects. And so it's, that's, again, we live in a trust-based, trust-based society, right? And especially with respect to these sorts of objects, you hear the emotion and the associated with them. What else do I need? But you know, that's just from a gold mining perspective, right? That's it.
Okay, so this is a complicated question for me. So the Met's general approach to provenance is transparency, and our aim is to have the fullest possible ownership history. I'm actually picking up on what was being said in the last panel, provenance and also provenience. Provenance being the chain of ownership, provenience being the place of discovery. So we have provenance and provenience both on the website. Transparency is really based on research. I have an amazing team of 10 provenance researchers who work with me, and our aim is to go through the entire collection of the Met, starting, I should say, with antiquities and pieces that may have been displaced as a result of colonial action, researching them to try and work out if any objects are problematic, as well as trying to be full in our disclosure. And when we do find things which are problematic, really that may be a springboard for repatriation or restitution, but more importantly for us, it's a springboard to collaboration. So the Met returned 2 pieces to Benin very few years ago, both of which we could find have been stolen and were improperly in New York. They were returned, but the really important thing is that as well as having a return, we also signed a memorandum of understanding with the Nigerian government, and we've been helping them going up and down to Lagos with our expertise, which we can share on conservation of their collection, on didactics, on cataloging the collection, on software, and on training. So yes, we lost 2 pieces in the collection, but really importantly, we now have a really close collaboration with the National Museum of Nigeria, as we do, I should say, with Cambodia, with Thailand, with India, with Greece, with Italy. With all those countries, we have this same context where we've returned things, there's been research and discovery, but most importantly, we now have a really robust relationship going forwards, which is for academic excellence and for understanding their collections and helping share expertise.
We are running up on time, so I wanted to make sure we opened up for any questions that may be in the audience. We have just a few minutes. Sure, I don't know where the microphone is, I'm sorry.
I like how this panel called the Human Rights Panel, and Igor, you used it from the right to cultural heritage, which is the right? But we also talked a lot about the right to development, the right to the environment, and from Ghana, I'd be really interested from both of your perspectives of what are your thought processes on balancing different rights of Ghana today, of the right of promoting the cultural heritage, which may or may not be known to different pockets of the country or community, and with the right to development of the ongoing gold mining that's happening today. And maybe a corollary question for Jazzy, with your mind there, have you ever thought, I'm not sure if this is a permanent return from your collection or if it's also a loan, but how have you thought of potentially addressing the right to culture as part of your human rights interventions in the country, of helping to promote and educate the history of these pieces? I think this has been a fascinating panel. Thanks.
I didn't get the first part of your question. You want to say?
Well, you're with the Bank of Ghana that's now monetizing gold for the country, right? But you're a cultural historian in the heritage, and I think I'd like MFA to try to help me here. I wonder how widespread. I don't know, as an expat, how widespread is the history and the knowledge of the art of these pieces known amongst the Ghanaian population? And so if the Ghanaian population have a right to know their cultural heritage at the same time as they have the right to development, to continue to benefit from gold as a resource in the country, how do you think about these two approaches in terms of the future of your country, given both your cultural and your background with the bank, if I can say that, yeah.
When these objects were first looted, there was a book that was written before then by a British trade envoy called Bowditch. Bowditch was in Kumasi and saw the processes of mining, turning rough gold into polished gold, and then he also visited the markets where gold jewelries were sold. He himself bought some of these. So later on, and when he wrote this book, The Mission from Cape Coast Castle to Asante in 1821, many in UK thought that, well, this was a fabrication of a society, and that he was playing on the fantasies of the ignorance of the British people. They never believed the things he wrote about art and architecture and virtually everything. So when these objects were looted and then they got to Britain, and some of them were publicized, showing the objects in photography, many people believed the book then. So the idea of writing about these objects later came up, because as I said earlier, notes were taken, and there were a lot of essays that were written around these objects. But because back home in Kumasi and in Ghana, orality was what prevailed at the time. Those who knew about these objects were those who were closer to the objects and would be within the palace premise. So they got better known in Europe than back home in Kumasi. And the objects also spread out. Some were sold to Germans, some were sold to other European art houses. So they spread to so many places. That's as was done to the Benin bronzes, not one stop, but many stops. And so the idea of getting to know of the history of these objects came back to us as a secondary source in terms of the literature of it. And now, thanks to also the return of these objects, a lot's been written about them now. When they were returned, the BBC World Service, BBC Radio 4, and major stations around the world, from Indian Broadcasting Corporation to Russian television, were all talking about the use of this. And within this short space, a 400-page book, I know, has been written by a BBC correspondent who was based in South Africa, but who has also been very interested in these looted objects. In fact, he wrote the Loot, which was a story about the Benin bronzes, and did so well, became a bestseller. So that is what it is. It's this return of objects that will also broaden the base, the knowledge of what these objects meant to those who created them and those who inherited them. And if I may want to add.
I would just like to add that gold was currency in Ghana before the British brought in fiat currency. So the comment you made earlier about monetizing gold, I mean, we clearly, Anglo gold have been mining in Obuasi for a very long time. That whole stretch of that region vomits gold, literally, which is why so many mines are there. And we do know about the history of the objects. And if people really do want to sort of study the Asante culture, or the Akan group actually, which is beyond the current borders of Ghana, so you're going into Ivory Coast and so on, they can do that. I don't think that it's that Ghanaians don't know about their culture. The reason the British took all of these things was greed, obviously, and marvel, because these are exquisite works of art. The one thing that I am concerned about is how many young people are taking up the craft of goldsmithing. I think that's something that we need to work on as a country and as for the Asantes. But in terms of education and how much people know about the objects, I do believe that they know. And now that these things are slowly going back to Kumasi, lots of school children visit, and so they will be able to see these objects, and hopefully that will inspire more sort of curiosity and a deep dive into the history of the Asante people. But, you know, the other ethnic groups in Ghana, it's not about gold, it's about beads, and so it depends on who you're dealing with. For the Asante, gold is king. For the Gas and the Ewes, we have beads. You know, we do have gold as well, but it's not as important to us as it is to the Asante people. And so you have to really take into account the many different ethnic groups in that tiny, tiny piece of Africa.
Well, thank
Okay.
you all, and
I'm
I will
terribly
give it to
sorry
Lisa,
about this.
yes.
There was this European, so I ferry all this, which is I countrified a continent, but at any rate, there's an expression, it's kidding me, and it's kidding me to stop this conversation because it's exceptional. It points out a few things. One, the beginning of the 2 days started with a discussion of trust, and trust has now filtered, you know, we see the criticality of it in this discussion, but also this conversation points the way to I would say the closing discussion of the conference, but perhaps the first of the resumption, which is what is precious. And the other thing is the criticality of talking about training and the future, because knowledge of heritage is part of, heritage is a resource that we often don't necessarily think of as a resource. It is time that we do so. How do we do so? So I don't have the answers to that, but at least we have the questions. I invite you to continue discussing them during lunch because it will filter through to the topic that is the prevalent one, that Rachel, the conversation that Rachel Perks and from the World Bank, and Estelle Levin-Nally will lead. But also, for whatever this is worth, I commit to this. We have to go forward with this, and thank you so much, each one of you, for being here.